Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for well over a decade and thought he had seen every possible human story play out on his stage. But on a crisp October afternoon in 2024, he was about to encounter something that would shake him to his core and leave him standing motionless, unable to speak. As a 96-year-old man revealed a truth he had carried in silence for 70 years. The studio audience was buzzing with their usual enthusiasm. Two families stood ready to compete, and the cameras were rolling on what everyone expected to be another entertaining episode filled with laughter, surprising answers, and maybe a few touching family moments. But what was about to unfold would transcend entertainment entirely, becoming instead a moment of profound revelation that would force everyone present to reconsider what they thought they knew about heroism, guilt, sacrifice, and the secrets we keep even from the people we love most. Before we go any further into this remarkable story, if you appreciate hearing about real people and the extraordinary truths they carry with them, please take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because what you are about to witness is a testament to the complexity of the human heart and the power of finally speaking a truth that has been buried for 7 decades. The Chen family from Seattle stood on one side of the stage, their matching green shirts emblazoned with their family name, their energy enthusiastic, and their smiles bright as they waved to the audience. On the other side stood the Morrison family from Georgia, equally spirited and ready to compete for the prize money. But among the Morrison family members was someone who immediately commanded attention, not through loudness or showmanship, but through sheer presence and the weight of years that seemed to emanate from him like an almost visible force. James Morrison was 96 years old, and he stood with the kind of military bearing that even 9.5 decades of life had not diminished. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and though his body showed the inevitable marks of age, there was something in the way he held himself that suggested discipline, strength, and a lifetime of carrying burdens that others could not see. His silver hair was cut short and neat, his face weathered and lined in the way that speaks of both hard work and hard choices, and his eyes held a depth that hinted at experiences most people could never imagine. James had been born in 1928 in a small farming community in rural Georgia, the youngest of 5 children in a family that struggled through the Great Depression with dignity and determination despite having almost nothing in terms of material wealth. His father had been a sharecropper, working land he would never own, breaking his back from dawn until dark to put food on the table for his children. His mother had taken in laundry and mending from the few families in their area who could afford to pay for such services. Her fingers worn raw from years of scrubbing and stitching, James had learned early what it meant to work hard, to make do with what you had, and to understand that life was often unfair, but that dignity and character were choices you made regardless of circumstances. He had walked 3 miles each way to attend a one-room schoolhouse, sharing textbooks with other students because there were not enough to go around. And he had been a good student despite the limitations, hungry for knowledge and determined to make something of himself. When James turned 17 in 1945, World War II was coming to its conclusion. And though he had been too young to serve in that conflict, he enlisted in the Army in 1948, seeing military service as both a duty and an opportunity to serve his country, while also gaining skills and experiences that would have been impossible for a poor farm boy to access otherwise. He had been sent to basic training and then assigned to an infantry unit, and he had expected to spend a few years in peacetime service before returning home to build a civilian life. But history had other plans. In June of 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, and suddenly America was at war again. James Morrison, barely 22 years old, found himself shipping out to Korea as part of the American military response to communist aggression in Asia. He arrived in Korea in August of 1950, and what he experienced over the next 2 years would mark him for the rest of his life in ways that he would never fully share with another human being. James had been assigned to a rifle company, and his unit had seen heavy combat throughout the war. He had fought in brutal conditions, facing an enemy that was well-trained and highly motivated, enduring Korean winters that were among the harshest imaginable, watching friends die, seeing horrors that no young man should have to witness, and somehow surviving when so many others did not. He had been a good soldier, reliable and brave, the kind of man his fellow soldiers trusted and his officers depended upon. He had been promoted to sergeant, leading a small squad of men who looked to him for leadership and protection. And it was in his role as squad leader that James had experienced the event that would define the rest of his life. The event that would become a secret he would guard with such fierce determination that not even his wife of 68 years would ever know the full truth of what had happened on a frozen hillside in Korea in January of 1951. James had returned from Korea in 1952, having completed his service and earned an honorable discharge. He had come home to Georgia, used the GI Bill to attend a technical college where he learned automotive mechanics, and had built a quiet, productive life for himself. He had met Ruth at a church social in 1954, a kind and gentle woman who worked as a school teacher, and they had married after a brief courtship, both of them ready to build a future together. They had raised 3 children, James working as the head mechanic at a local dealership for 40 years before retiring, Ruth teaching elementary school until her own retirement. They had been pillars of their community, active in their church, involved in their children's lives, and respected by everyone who knew them. James had been a devoted husband, a loving father, and later a doting grandfather to 7 grandchildren, and great-grandfather to 12 great-grandchildren. He had lived what appeared to be a straightforward, honest, uncomplicated life, marked by hard work, strong values, and steady devotion to family and community. But there had always been something that James had not shared, a part of his past that he had deliberately concealed from everyone, including Ruth, including his children, including every single person he had encountered in the 70 years since he left Korea. There were medals stored in a locked box in his workshop, medals he had never displayed and never mentioned. There were documents and citations and official letters that he had hidden away, looking at them perhaps once or twice a year in private moments when he was alone, and the memories became too heavy to bear without some physical acknowledgement of their reality. There was a story of what had actually happened on that Korean hillside, a story the Army knew and had documented and honored, but a story that James himself felt he had no right to tell, because he believed that accepting credit for what happened would be a betrayal of the man who had actually earned that recognition. The man who had died so that James and 4 other soldiers could live. James had carried this secret through his entire adult life, through his marriage, through raising his children, through building his career, through every holiday and birthday and ordinary day that made up 7 decades of living. The weight of it had shaped him in ways his family could sense but never quite understand. They knew he did not like to talk about the war, that he became quiet and withdrawn if Korea was mentioned, that he kept certain parts of himself closed off, even from those he loved most. They had attributed this to trauma, to the normal reluctance of combat veterans to revisit painful memories, and they had respected his privacy and never pushed him to share more than he was willing to offer. What they did not know was that James's silence was not simply about protecting himself from painful memories, but about a deep and abiding belief that he did not deserve to be honored for actions he saw as a failure, that accepting recognition would compound his guilt, and that speaking the truth would mean admitting to a grief and a sense of responsibility that he did not know how to articulate or resolve. Ruth had passed away 2 years before this Family Feud appearance. Her death after 68 years of marriage, leaving James bereft and untethered in ways that frightened his children. They had watched their father, always so steady and strong, seem to diminish after losing his wife, his purpose and direction less clear, his days less structured, his engagement with life less certain. They had done everything they could to support him, inviting him for regular dinners, including him in family activities, calling and visiting frequently. His oldest daughter, Patricia, had suggested applying for Family Feud as a way to create a positive family experience and give James something to look forward to, something that might pull him out of the grief that seemed to be consuming him. The family had applied, been selected, and made the journey to the studio as a multi-generational group that included James, 2 of his children, and 2 of his grandchildren. They had hoped the experience would be fun and maybe even healing, a way to honor Ruth's memory by doing something she would have enjoyed watching them do together. What none of them could have anticipated was that this game show appearance would become the moment when James finally decided to speak the truth he had carried alone for 70 years. Now standing on the Family Feud stage under bright lights with cameras recording and an audience watching, James felt the weight of his secret pressing on him with an intensity he had not experienced in years. Perhaps it was Ruth's death and the realization that the person who had known him best, even if she had not known everything, was gone and he was running out of time to speak his truth. Perhaps it was being surrounded by his children and grandchildren and feeling the love and respect they had for him, and knowing that their image of who he was remained incomplete. Perhaps it was simply that after 70 years, the burden had become too heavy to continue carrying alone, and something in him was ready to finally set it down, regardless of the consequences. Steve Harvey began his introduction of the families, bringing his characteristic energy and humor to the proceedings. When he reached James, Steve paused with visible respect, taking in the elderly man's military bearing and obvious dignity. Steve asked James his age, and when James replied that he was 96, the audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Steve commented on how remarkable it was to see someone of James's age looking so strong and vital, and he asked James what his secret to longevity was. James smiled slightly and said the secret was hard work, clean living, and marrying a good woman, though he mentioned that he had lost Ruth 2 years ago and was still learning how to navigate life without her. Steve expressed his condolences with genuine warmth, and the mood in the studio shifted to something more tender. Then Steve asked James if he had served in the military, picking up on the bearing that suggested a military background. James confirmed that he had served in the Army and had been in Korea, and Steve thanked him for his service as the audience applauded again. The game began, and both families competed with energy and good humor. James contributed answers when his turn came, displaying the same steady competence that had marked his entire life. His family members kept glancing at him with obvious affection and pride, clearly pleased to be sharing this experience with their beloved patriarch. The competition was close and entertaining, with both families performing well and the lead changing several times. The Morrison family ultimately won the main game by accumulating more points, and they advanced to fast money for a chance at the $20,000 grand prize. Patricia, James's daughter, volunteered to go first, and she handled the rapid-fire questions competently, scoring 138 points. That meant the second family member needed to score 62 points to reach the 200-point threshold and win the money. The family began discussing who should take the second spot, and James, to everyone's surprise, stepped forward with quiet determination and said he would do it. His family looked uncertain, worried that the pressure might be too much for their 96-year-old father and grandfather. But something in James's expression told them this was important to him in a way they did not fully understand. They deferred to his wishes, and James moved to the fast money podium. Steve Harvey approached James with a mixture of admiration and concern, asking if he was certain he wanted to take on the challenge at his age. James looked at Steve with those deep, knowing eyes and said he was certain that there was something he needed to do, and this was his opportunity. Steve, sensing there was more happening beneath the surface than he could see, nodded respectfully and told James he would give him his very best questions. The 20 seconds went on the clock, and Steve began firing questions at James. Name something you associate with Abraham Lincoln. Honesty, James answered immediately. Name a reason someone might skip breakfast. Running late. Name something people do at a birthday party. Sing. Name a place where you need to show identification. Airport. Name something that flies. Birds. The buzzer sounded, and James stepped back from the podium, his expression inscrutable. Steve began revealing the results. Honesty for something you associate with Abraham Lincoln showed as the number 1 answer, scoring 43 points. Running late as a reason to skip breakfast came up as the number 2 answer, adding 31 points. Sing for something people do at a birthday party was the number 1 answer, contributing 39 points. The family was getting excited, realizing they were close to the target. Airport for a place where you need to show identification showed as the number 1 answer, adding 37 more points. Birds for something that flies was revealed as the number 1 answer, contributing 42 points. James had achieved something remarkable, scoring 192 points in his fast money round, with all his answers ranking either first or second, bringing the family's combined total to 330 points. The Morrison family had won, and the studio erupted in celebration. Steve Harvey stood looking at James with genuine amazement, clearly impressed by the 96-year-old man's performance under pressure. The audience gave James a standing ovation that lasted for nearly a minute, and his family surrounded him with hugs and congratulations. But Steve noticed something in James's expression that did not match the moment of triumph. There was no joy in the old man's eyes, no satisfaction in his achievement. Instead, there seemed to be a deep sadness, almost a resignation, as if winning the game had triggered something in him that was about to overflow. Steve approached James and asked him if he was okay, commenting that he did not look like someone who had just won $20,000 for his family. James took a deep breath and looked at Steve with an intensity that made the host instinctively lean in closer. James said he needed to tell Steve something, needed to tell his family something, needed to speak a truth that he had kept silent for 70 years because he could not carry it alone anymore, and he could not leave this world without finally being honest about who he was and what had happened to him. The studio fell silent, the celebration pausing as everyone sensed that something significant was about to occur. Steve's expression shifted from confusion to focused attention, and he told James to take his time and share whatever he needed to share. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn and aged, clearly something he had carried for a very long time. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, and he withdrew a medal, a distinctive bronze star hanging from a light blue ribbon with white stars. Even people unfamiliar with military decorations could sense from its appearance and James's handling of it that this was something important, something significant. James held the medal in his weathered hand, and he looked at his children and grandchildren, his eyes filling with tears that he had clearly been holding back for decades. He told them that what he was about to reveal was something their mother and grandmother had never known. Something he had hidden not out of shame for what he did, but out of shame for what he failed to do, and that he needed them to understand that everything they thought they knew about him was incomplete. Steve Harvey stood absolutely still, his usual quick wit and commentary abandoned in the face of whatever was unfolding before him. James began to speak, his voice growing stronger as words that had been locked inside for 70 years finally found their release. He told his family that in January of 1951, he had been a sergeant in the army stationed in Korea, leading a squad of 8 men in brutal winter combat conditions. He said they had been tasked with holding a hill position against a much larger enemy force, that they had been outnumbered at least 10-1, and that over the course of 3 days they had fought off multiple attacks, suffered casualties, and were running out of ammunition and supplies. He said that on the 3rd night, the enemy launched a massive assault designed to overrun their position, and that he and his remaining 5 men were facing certain death or capture. James paused, his voice breaking with emotion, and then he continued with the part of the story that had haunted him for 7 decades. He said that his best friend, a soldier named Thomas Riley from Ohio, had been positioned with him in a foxhole when the enemy breakthrough occurred. He said that Thomas had seen enemy soldiers flanking their position with grenades, preparing to wipe out the entire squad. He said that Thomas, without hesitation and without being ordered, had climbed out of their foxhole, exposed himself to enemy fire, and charged directly at the enemy position, firing his weapon and drawing attention away from James and the other soldiers. James's voice was now thick with tears as he explained that Thomas had been hit multiple times, but had kept moving forward, had kept firing, had given James and the others those precious seconds they needed to reposition and return fire. He said that Thomas had single-handedly disrupted the enemy assault, had saved all 5 of the remaining squad members, but had died in the process, his body falling in the Korean snow, his sacrifice immediate and total and unquestionable. James explained that after the battle, after reinforcements had arrived and the enemy had been driven back, after they had retrieved Thomas's body and mourned their fallen friend, the army had conducted an investigation into what happened. He said that multiple soldiers had testified to Thomas's heroism, that the officers had documented the extraordinary courage and selfless sacrifice that had saved lives, and that the army had decided to award recognition for the actions taken that night. But here was where James's voice dropped to almost a whisper, where the real secret finally emerged after 70 years of silence. James explained that the army, in processing the paperwork and reviewing the testimony, had made an error in their records. They had attributed Thomas's actions to James himself. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration for valor in combat, had been awarded to James Morrison for actions that Thomas Riley had actually performed. James said that when he first learned about the award, he had been shocked and had immediately tried to correct the error, had gone to his commanding officers, and explained that he had not done what they were describing, that Thomas Riley was the hero who deserved recognition, that accepting an honor for actions he did not take would be a betrayal of his friend's memory and sacrifice. But James explained that the army had been insistent, that the official records and citations had already been processed and approved at the highest levels, that the witnesses who had been interviewed had in the chaos and darkness of battle apparently confused James and Thomas, or had assumed that because James was the sergeant, he had been the one to take the lead action, and that the military bureaucracy in its wisdom or stubbornness had decided that the award would stand as issued. James said he had been given the Medal of Honor in a ceremony that felt like a nightmare, had shaken hands and accepted congratulations from officers and officials who praised him for heroism he knew belonged to his dead friend, had felt like a fraud and an imposter, even as they hung the medal around his neck. He explained that when he returned home after his service ended, he could not bring himself to tell anyone about the medal or to display it, or to accept any recognition based on it. He said he had locked it away along with the citation and the official documents, had told Ruth and everyone else that he preferred not to talk about his war experiences, and had spent 70 years living with the knowledge that the nation had honored him for something he did not do, while Thomas Riley, the true hero, lay in a grave marked only with a standard military headstone, with no special recognition for the extraordinary courage he had displayed. James said that he had tried over the years to get the Army to correct the record, had written letters and made phone calls, but that the military had maintained that their records were accurate and that any correction would require new testimony and evidence that no longer existed because the other witnesses had died or could not be located. He said he had eventually accepted that the error would never be officially corrected, but that he could at least refuse to personally benefit from or acknowledge an honor that was not rightfully his. James looked at his children and grandchildren with tears streaming down his face and told them that he had been living a lie for 70 years. That every time they had called him a hero or thanked him for his service or looked at him with pride, he had felt like a fraud because he knew the truth of what happened and who had actually earned the title of hero. He said he had kept silent because he did not know how to explain the complexity of what happened, because he feared they would lose respect for him if they knew he had accepted an honor under false pretenses, and because speaking about it meant confronting the grief and guilt he felt over Thomas's death and his own survival. He said that Ruth had died without ever knowing, and that he regretted that silence every day, but that he could not leave this world without finally speaking the truth, without honoring Thomas's memory by acknowledging what actually happened, and without being honest with his family about who he really was. Steve Harvey stood completely frozen, his mouth open, his eyes wide, his entire body rigid with shock as the magnitude of what James had just revealed settled over the studio. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, the silence absolute and heavy with the weight of 70 years of hidden truth finally brought into the light. When Steve finally found his voice, it emerged rough and unsteady, barely above a whisper. He told James that what he had just heard was one of the most profound and heartbreaking revelations he had encountered in his entire life. That James had been carrying an impossible burden for 7 decades, and that the courage it took to finally speak this truth was itself a form of heroism regardless of what happened in Korea. Steve turned to James's children and grandchildren, who were standing motionless, clearly struggling to process what their father and grandfather had just shared. He told them that they needed to understand something important, that what James had done by carrying this secret and this grief for 70 years, while still being a devoted husband, father, and grandfather, while still building a good life and serving his community, while still maintaining his integrity and his values, was itself an act of extraordinary strength and character. Steve turned back to James and said something that would change everything. He told James that he understood why James felt the way he did, understood the guilt and the sense of unworthiness, but that James needed to consider another perspective. Steve said that Thomas Riley had made his choice to save his friends, had acted with courage and selflessness, and had died a hero regardless of whether a medal acknowledged that truth. Steve said that James, by surviving, by carrying the memory of Thomas's sacrifice, by living a good and honorable life, By raising a family and serving his community and maintaining his integrity for 70 years, had in fact honored Thomas in the most profound way possible. Steve said that Thomas had died so that James could live, and James had taken that gift and used it to build something meaningful, to create a legacy of love and service that had touched hundreds of people over 7 decades. Steve said that accepting that you survived when your friend died was not dishonoring their sacrifice, but rather validating it, proving that their death accomplished its purpose by allowing someone worthy to continue living. Then Steve did something that nobody expected. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there on stage, in front of the cameras and the audience, explaining that he had connections at the Department of Defense through his various charitable work with veterans. He spoke to someone on the other end of the call, briefly explaining James's situation, and after a few minutes of conversation, he hung up and looked at James with an expression of determination. Steve told James that he was not going to let this stand, that he was going to use whatever influence and connections he had to get the Army to review this case, to correct the record so that Thomas Riley received proper recognition, and to help James find peace with what happened. Steve said that James had suffered long enough under the weight of this secret, that Thomas's family deserved to know the truth of his heroism, and that both men deserved proper acknowledgement of what happened on that Korean hillside 70 years ago. The audience erupted in applause, many people openly crying at the raw emotion and profound revelation they had just witnessed. James's children moved forward to embrace their father, telling him that nothing about what he had revealed diminished their love or respect for him, that they understood why he had kept silent, and that they were honored to know the truth even if it had taken 70 years for him to share it. His grandchildren gathered around him as well. This man they had always seen as strong and dignified, now revealed to be even more complex and human than they had imagined. Steve told James that the $20,000 they had won was his to use however he wished, but that if James wanted, Steve would personally contribute matching funds to establish a memorial or scholarship in Thomas Riley's name, ensuring that the true hero of that January night in 1951 would finally receive lasting recognition. James could barely speak through his tears, but he managed to thank Steve and to say that he had carried this weight for so long that finally speaking it aloud felt like being released from a prison he had built for himself. The episode aired 8 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans organizations contacted the show asking for more information about Thomas Riley and James's case. Military historians expressed interest in reviewing the records and helping to establish the accurate account of what happened. The Department of Defense, facing public pressure and renewed attention to the case, announced that they would conduct a formal review of the Korean War records and citations related to James Morrison and Thomas Riley. Most movingly, Thomas Riley's surviving family members, including a niece who was now in her 70s, reached out after seeing the episode. They had never known the full story of their uncle's death, had been told only that he died heroically in combat, and they were both heartbroken and grateful to finally understand the truth of his sacrifice. They expressed no anger toward James, instead thanking him for carrying the memory of Thomas for all these years, and for finally speaking the truth that allowed them to properly honor their uncle's heroism. 6 months after the Family Feud appearance, the Department of Defense completed their review. While they determined that the original Medal of Honor award to James Morrison would stand based on the testimony and records from the time, they also conducted a posthumous investigation into Thomas Riley's actions and concluded that his conduct that night met the criteria for the Medal of Honor as well. In an unprecedented ceremony held at Arlington National Cemetery, Thomas Riley was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor 73 years after his death. James Morrison, now 97 years old, attended the ceremony along with Thomas's surviving family members. When the medal was presented, James stepped forward and spoke about his friend, describing Thomas's character, his courage, and his sacrifice in a way he had never been able to articulate before. He said that Thomas had been the best man he ever knew, that not a day had passed in 73 years when he had not thought about his friend, and that finally seeing Thomas properly recognized brought him a sense of peace he had not felt since that terrible night in Korea. The ceremony concluded with James and Thomas's niece standing together at Thomas's grave, which had been relocated to a place of honor in Arlington National Cemetery. James placed his own Medal of Honor on Thomas's gravestone, leaving it there as a symbol of recognition and respect. And he told Thomas, speaking aloud to his long-dead friend, that he hoped he had lived a life worthy of the gift Thomas had given him, that he had tried to honor that sacrifice by being a good man, and that he was sorry it had taken 73 years to tell the truth. Thomas's niece embraced James, telling him that her uncle would have been proud of how James had lived his life and grateful that the truth had finally been spoken. Steve Harvey attended the ceremony as well, documenting it for a special segment that would air on his talk show. He spoke about how James's revelation on Family Feud had not only brought peace to one elderly veteran, but had also ensured that a forgotten hero received the recognition he deserved, and that a family gained understanding of their uncle's extraordinary courage. In the year following the ceremony, James Morrison became an advocate for military record accuracy and for ensuring that combat veterans receive proper recognition for their service and sacrifice. He spoke at veterans organizations, military academies, and community events about the importance of truth, the complexity of survivors' guilt, and the need for systems that accurately document and honor heroism. He always carried a photograph of Thomas Riley with him, showing it to audiences and telling them about the real hero of that January night in 1951. He established a scholarship fund in Thomas's name for descendants of Korean War veterans, using the $20,000 from Family Feud as seed money and raising additional funds through his speaking engagements and Steve Harvey's matching contribution. The scholarship had helped dozens of young people attend college, each one learning about Thomas Riley's sacrifice as part of receiving their award. James's family dynamics shifted after the revelation, becoming deeper and more honest as they all processed the truth he had shared. His children told him they wished he had felt able to share the burden earlier, that they would have supported him through the guilt and grief if they had known, but they understood why he had kept silent, and they respected the choice he had made. His grandchildren gained a new appreciation for their grandfather's complexity, understanding that heroism was not always straightforward, and that integrity sometimes meant carrying heavy truths in silence. The family gathered more frequently, sharing meals and stories, and James found himself more willing to talk about his experiences, not just in Korea, but throughout his life, no longer feeling the need to guard certain parts of himself quite so carefully. 2 years after the Family Feud appearance, James Morrison passed away peacefully at age 98, surrounded by his family. At his funeral, Thomas Riley's niece attended, bringing with her the Medal of Honor that James had placed on Thomas's grave, which the family had later retrieved and kept as a symbol of the bond between the two men. She presented it to James's children, telling them that both men had been heroes in different ways, and that the medal represented not just military valor, but also the courage to finally speak difficult truths and to honor friendship across 7 decades of separation. The story of James Morrison and Thomas Riley became a case study in military history courses, an example of the complexities of combat recognition and the human cost of bureaucratic errors. Veterans organizations used their story to advocate for more careful review processes and better support systems for soldiers dealing with survivors' guilt and moral injury. Counselors and therapists working with veterans referenced James's experience when helping clients understand that carrying secrets and unresolved guilt for decades was neither necessary nor healthy, and that speaking difficult truths, even after many years, could bring healing and peace. And countless ordinary people who watched that Family Feud episode or heard about James's revelation found themselves thinking differently about the secrets they carried, the truths they had not spoken, and the possibility that honesty, even when delayed, could still make a difference. If you found yourself moved by James Morrison's story of carrying an unbearable secret for 70 years and finally finding the courage to speak his truth, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with veterans in your life, with family members who might be carrying their own heavy truths, and with anyone who needs to understand that it is never too late to be honest about who we are and what we have experienced. James taught us that secrets, even those kept with good intentions, can become prisons that separate us from the people we love and from our own peace of mind. He showed us that true heroism sometimes means surviving when others did not, and honoring their sacrifice by living well and truthfully. He demonstrated that speaking difficult truths, even after 7 decades, can bring healing not just to ourselves, but to others who deserve to know and understand what actually happened. Most importantly, James reminded us that integrity means telling the truth even when that truth reflects our own perceived failures, and that real courage is not the absence of guilt or fear, but the willingness to face those feelings and speak honestly despite them. Thomas Riley gave his life to save his friends on a frozen Korean hillside, and James Morrison spent 70 years trying to honor that sacrifice in the only way he knew how, through silence and service. In the end, both men were heroes, and both men deserved the recognition they finally received. Thank you for watching this remarkable story, and may we all find the courage to speak our truths before it is too late.